Since its release in 2021, Grand Theft Auto The Trilogy Definitive Edition has been a stain on Rockstar Games' reputation. And out of nowhere, 3 years and a day following the game's re-releases, they perplexingly dropped a massive update out of nowhere. And aside from the obvious, God knows what it actually does, they didn't release any patch notes. They just kind of shadow dropped it and refused to elaborate. And you'd think, considering the update came with a total lighting overhaul that does somewhat enhance the visual aspect, they'd want to elaborate more than just simply summarising it as numerous fixes and improvements, and then mentioning that as if they also haven't done 6 billion other things. Now, it's been a few days since this patch has dropped as of recording this video, and it wasn't high on my priority list when I heard about it the first time, but since I had some time free to, I don't know, either maybe go outside and get a life, or catch up on my crippling sleep debt, I decided to not do that and instead have a look at this, not only to figure out why on earth they bothered to add quality of life improvements and visual tweaks to remasters that are kind of dead and buried, but also to find out if the definitive edition is no longer abusing the word definitive and has been fixed. If you're unfamiliar with the situation from 2021 and are probably wondering what was wrong with Grand Theft Auto The Trilogy The Definitive Edition, well, I think it would be easier to tell you what wasn't. You see, aside from this re-release's name being an agonising mouthful, it garnered disdain from the series' reasonably devoted fanbase for simply far too many reasons to list. And so, I'll give you the major ones. The first being these games not actually being based on the original versions of the game, but rather the port to mobile platforms, which required a different engine to be used. That not only resulted in mechanical compromises, but certainly pissed away an awful lot of familiarity. Then of course the art direction got lost in enhancing the graphics, that fog that enveloped these world maps, making them feel bigger than they perhaps were, and contributing towards providing an unintentionally eerie atmosphere that people came to love, was nowhere to be seen. Fortunately they've brought that back, but we'll come to that in a bit. Laughable bugs were of course abundant. There were untenable gameplay roadblocks, such as not being able to shoot and move at the same time, which made life difficult at the best of times. And worst of all, if you wanted to buy the original versions that had existed for 2 decades and are much beloved by fans, it was made only legally possible if you purchased the remasters at a premium. Of course, you could find second-hand physical copies here and there, but GTA's historically been quite a saucy game, and gamers are gamers, so you touch another man's copy at your own risk. Jokes aside, the unnecessary obstacle in the name of profit on a new release was unwelcome, and Grove Street Games, the company behind putting these demasters into action, weren't very popular. And Rockstar 2 got their fair share of disdain for butchering a beloved trilogy. With GTA 6 now known to be in the pipeline, I think you'd be forgiven for believing that paying any mind to such a failing would be unexpected, especially at the back end of 2024, when we're hopefully sat on the precipice of that game's marketing ramping up exponentially. However, here we are, and I'd like to pay some attention to just what's noticeably changed, and the first thing is obviously the visuals. Not gonna lie, underneath it's still fairly rough. These are, after all, 2 decades old graphics that have gone through both a washing machine and then a tumble dryer, and that is to be expected of remasters as opposed to remakes, so to discuss it in relative terms, above all else I'm talking about the lighting. Nothing quite sucked the soul out of the remasters in 2011, quite like being able to see the other end of the map because there's no fog, and the modern approach to lighting through the Unreal Engine deployed by Grove Street Games that really didn't gel well with the other visual aspects. Fortunately, classic mode in the graphics settings, which is now on by default, fixes that, although you can still turn it off and see how the definitive edition has looked since 2021. As you can see, this does more than reimpose fog on the worlds. It provides an entirely different lighting setup that looks more complementary to the visuals and harkens back to how these games originally looked back when they released over 2 decades ago in some cases. As simple a thing as it sounds, most of the time the difference is unsubtle, and it certainly serves to re-inject some of the atmosphere that was lost in translation, so to speak, because in the end of the day, having realistic lighting isn't going to complement how the rest of the game looks, let's face it. This option, instead of dealing in subtle tones that render the negative space completely barren, provides the space between things some much needed volume. You see, now we live in a time where you can get pretty close to realistic visuals in games and have done for some time. But when these games did release in their original formats, this wasn't the case, and so a lot of creative decisions, especially regarding visuals, are moulded around the technological limitations. The byproduct is a distinct art style. One of the remaster's major issues is it wasn't true to that, and with the classic lighting it feels a lot truer than it was. However, of course, more work is needed to fix this bland aesthetic, and more work has been put in. You see, according to @VideotechUK_ on what is formerly Twitter, whose real name is Ben, very important, though I suspect it's actually Brian and he's responsible for selling weapons to the gnomes in my garden. He, with the aid of others, has assembled quite the extensive list of patch notes. It's very extensive. Okay, you can stop scrolling now, we get it. And on the front of improvements to visuals, the classic lighting mode is the tip of the iceberg. For instance, the issue of the past of shadows shifting in chunks has been rectified and now they render in real time. There are updated reflections that use cube map reflections instead of Unreal Engine's SSR, which resolves artifacting issues. Some 3D interiors have been removed, and in other cases, the issues where they stretch upon approaching them has been rectified. One thing I did notice for myself that Ben also mentioned in his list is that fire now produces lens flares. I also want to say it looks a bit nicer than how it did, but perhaps I'm imagining that it deals in softer tones. It also must be said the weather effects are much easier on the eyes now, and I did notice much more haze to go with the fog even when I had the classic lighting turned off. And everything comes together to make the most distinct difference this update provides. And the fact the classic lighting defaults to on when you boot the game up post-update does give you a rather good idea of Rockstar's opinion on the visuals of the remaster prior to that point. There are still some visual blips, I would argue. In some cases the faces look barely like faces at all, though I don't know how fair it is to hold that against the definitive editions when it was hardly a selling point of the original games. Either way, this monstrosity is still ever so slightly distracting. I suppose my main gripe visually would be that the character models are still a little bit funny looking, but I suppose it could be worse. As far as other issues are concerned, some animations have been rectified. For instance, riding a bike in San Andreas no longer makes you look like somebody hit your back with a hammer, and if you ask me, that's always a bonus. Lighting in some cutscenes, especially towards the back end of the trilogy, have seen some improvement, and we can also now pause cutscenes on a different note. That's nice, meaning if you're dying for the loo or if you momentarily need to step away, you can whenever. I do hate having to skip cutscenes and pause games when the dog finds the power drill and I need to go downstairs and stop him before he gets lofty ideas of world domination. He's learned how to open doors. I'll leave a link to everything that's actually changed in the description if you want to waft through that. Not that it's necessarily a complete list as of yet, but people are working diligently on it. But to summarise, the bulk of the remaining changes fall under minor tweaks to gameplay, visuals, animations, and of course the never-ending battle to rectify bugs, and it would seem the intentions subtly laid down by Rockstar are quite clear, and that is to finally bring this cursed remaster up to standard. I am somewhat surprised they've opted to do this so subtly, considering you'd think it would be good PR. I suppose there's an irony in me saying that, considering what this video could be classified as up until this point, but unfortunately in this day and age, good and bad press seldom exist in a vacuum. It didn't take long for people to note that Grove Street Games had been scrubbed from the splash screens at the start of the game. Games even. I keep slipping on that. Well, it would seem Grove Street Games noticed this too, with Thomas Williamson, the self-fashioned final boss of Grove Street Games, took to what is now effectively Elon Musk the website to propose a rather oddly specific hypothetical. Speaking entire hypothetically, that's actually what it says, entire. It's a dick move to remove primary developers from credits in an update, especially when an update includes hundreds of fixes that were provided by those developers that stayed out of players' hands for years. It's a very odd time to propose such a hypothetical, especially when, at least as far as splash screens are concerned, that appears to be the case for the Definitive Edition's recent update. I have it on good authority they're still in the actual credits, but I'm not going to dedicate a full playthrough just to find out. And look, I'm not going to weigh in on what professional drama might be occurring between two corporate entities in the end of the day, and I only really mention it because I'm sure it's everywhere. But what I will say is the internet has a tendency to sniff a whiff of drama and run 1,000 miles with it. Understandably, however, purging Grove Street Games from the splash screens will tweak them on the nose. And where your opinions on that will lie, I suppose, depends entirely on how much you blame Grove Street Games for how the Definitive Editions turned out. Do you think the actual developers who worked the remaster are squarely responsible? Or do you think it's more likely that the project got caught up in a wash of corporate bollocks that resulted in a product being released unpolished and unfinished? And because the remasters were outsourced, there's a scapegoat of sorts. But splash screen delete gate isn't what I'm interested in. I'm more curious about the idea that many of the patches we're receiving now have existed for years and we've only just received them. Now, this is far from confirmation this is the case. After all, matey lads speaking in hypotheticals, so must I. But if theoretically a remaster released and was categorically fucked, a total dumpster fire, and instead of the continued critical acclaim you were hoping for in a similar vein to the original titles, you got a barrage of negative press, would it make more sense to knee-jerk and make tiny patches that don't make much of a difference, or to build everything up and create an instant impact? Either way, your reputation takes a hit because you published something that was arse, and let me be clear, that should not have happened. And my point is not to defend Rockstar in any capacity with regards to that disaster, but when a project has crashed and burned and everybody's inevitably moved on, does it really matter when they attempt to revive it? Or is it only important that they do eventually fix the problems? I mean, sure, you could bring in the argument regarding people having paid money for this at launch, and that's valid. Personally, I find that to be a reasonable point of discussion. Why does my car look like it's partial to a good cigarette? Whichever approach you think gets adopted, you're applying it exclusively to damage control scenarios. And considering just how many fixes have been included, obviously not including the utterly useless cinematic camera, it would make sense that in order for a patch of that mass to occur, they probably needed to hold on to some fixes longer than others. But 3 years and a day? Let me know your thoughts. To conclude today's video, I don't think it's a bad thing that Rockstar has finally dropped this update that rectifies a lot of the grievances players had with the Trilogy Definitive Edition. Maybe it hasn't fixed all of them, but it's certainly a step in the right direction for what was otherwise an ugly duckling in Rockstar Games' lineup. I don't understand why they've chosen to do it now, so long down the line, but better people have tried and failed to understand why Rockstar Games do what they do. This can't, however, be used to excuse the fact that Rockstar Games were complicit in releasing these remasters in the first place when they were unfit for release, and so I can't give my recommendation as to whether or not you should dive back in, as that's a decision you have to make for yourself, because if you think the bar of quality's been met and you're more than happy to dive in, that's fair enough, but at the same time, if you don't feel you owe Rockstar Games the patience to do it, then I understand that that too is a reasonable mindset. And of course, there will always be people who hate what this remaster stands for more than any of the contents of the games themselves, because Rockstar made purchasing the original versions much harder. As for whether or not the Definitive Edition is fixed, and actually deserves to be referred to as definitive, I think other tweaks and patches may be required in future to make that a thing, and whether or not those occur, I don't know, but a massive update does suggest maybe. For the time being, however, it is at the very least a much more bearable experience. Whatever your thoughts are, I'd absolutely love to know, but I'd like to thank you for watching this short video as far as I'm concerned. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, maybe share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. If you fancy it, it would be massively appreciated. And if you wish to pop me a follow on some social media, it exists, but there's no pressure there either. Nonetheless, with any luck, hopefully I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, please take care, and goodbye.